Sometimes, the smallest amount of money can carry the heaviest silence. The register screen flickered in pale blue light, holding steady on $3.86 short, and no one in the small grocery store seemed willing to breathe as Daniel Hayes stood there with his shoulders slightly hunched, fingers tightening around a few worn bills that had been folded too many times to count, his coat thin against the early winter chill that still clung to him, even indoors. And though he didn't look up, you could feel the weight pressing down on him, the kind that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with pride slowly slipping through his hands. Behind him, Lucas Reed shifted his stance, the quiet creak of his boots barely audible against the tiled floor, his marine instincts already pulling him forward, ready to close the gap, to cover what was missing without a second thought. Because some things you don't hesitate over, not when you've seen how quickly life can strip a man of everything. But beside him, Rex didn't move, the German shepherd standing unnaturally. Still, ears angled forward, body tense in a way that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with focus, as if he were listening to something deeper than sound. The fluorescent lights above hummed softly, casting long reflections across the polished floor, and somewhere near the back aisle, a cartwheel clicked faintly, but all of it faded into the background when Rex's gaze locked, not on Daniel's face, but on the worn canvas bag hanging loosely from his hand, the fabric frayed at, the edges swaying just slightly with each shallow breath he took. Lucas reached into his pocket, fingers brushing against his wallet, already halfway, committed to stepping forward, but then Rex shifted, a single step that cut through the moment like a quiet interruption, his leash pulling just enough to stop Lucas mid-motion, and the Marine frowned, glancing down at his partner, because this wasn't hesitation, this was intention. Daniel swallowed hard, his voice low and almost apologetic as he spoke to the cashier, something about putting the bread back, about it not being a big deal, but the words didn't quite land, not when they carried the sound of a man who had said them too many times before. And just as he began to turn, to retreat with what little dignity he could gather, Rex moved, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate, closing the small distance between them until his nose hovered near the bag, his body lowering slightly, weight shifting as if guided by a memory older than commands. The leash tightened, Lucas now fully alert, his instincts catching up to something he didn't yet understand. And then, Rex nudged the bag, firm enough to break the stillness, the canvas slipping from Daniel's grip and hitting the floor with a dull, hollow sound that echoed far louder than it should have in such a small space, drawing every eye in the store. And for a moment, no one moved, not the cashier, not the customers, not even Daniel, who simply stared down at the bag, as if it had betrayed him. But Rex stepped closer, one paw lifting, then pressing lightly against the fabric, holding it in place like he had found something worth stopping the world for. And Lucas felt it then, that strange shift in the air, the kind that didn't come from noise or motion, but from something unseen beginning to surface, something that had been waiting quietly for the exact right moment to be found. Daniel's breath caught somewhere between his chest and his throat as he slowly crouched down, his fingers hovering over the fallen bag like he was not sure it still belonged to him. And for a second he glanced around, not in anger, not in embarrassment this time, but in something quieter, something closer to fear, as if whatever Rex had sensed might reveal more than he was ready to show, while the dog remained still, paw resting firmly against the fabric, amber eyes locked with a calm intensity that did not waver. And Lucas felt it deepen, that strange pull in the air, the kind that reminded him of long nights overseas when silence meant something was about to change. "Easy, boy," Lucas murmured under his breath, but there was no command in it, only curiosity now, because Rex was not acting out, he was guiding, and that difference mattered more than most people would ever understand. Daniel finally exhaled, a slow, unsteady breath, and reached for the bag, his hand brushing against the spot where Rex had pressed. And as he lifted it, something inside shifted with a faint metallic sound, soft but distinct, like an echo from a place far away. And his fingers paused, tightening just slightly before he opened the worn flap, the canvas creasing with a familiar sound that carried years of use. Years of holding onto things that were never meant to be seen by strangers. The cashier leaned forward. Just a little, her expression no longer impatient but uncertain, while a man near the freezer section turned fully now, arms crossed, drawn in despite himself, because moments like this did not happen in ordinary mornings. Daniel reached inside the bag, slower than before, as if he already knew what he would find, and when his hand emerged, it held something small, something dull and aged, catching the overhead light in a way that made time feel visible, and Lucas felt his pulse shift the second he saw it, not clearly yet, not fully, but enough to stir a memory that had been buried beneath years of distance and discipline. The object slipped slightly in Daniel's grasp and fell again, this time onto the tile with a sharper sound, and Lucas stepped forward without thinking, instinct overriding hesitation as he knelt and picked it up, his fingers brushing over the cold surface, tracing the worn edges, the engraved lines softened by time, and in that instant, everything around him seemed to narrow, the hum of the lights, the faint sounds of movement, all fading into a distant blur as recognition began to take shape, slow and undeniable. Rex moved closer, his posture easing just enough to signal that this was what he had been waiting for, his tail lowering but not in fear, in certainty, and Daniel watched, his eyes fixed on the object now, in Lucas's hand, something unreadable flickering across his face, a mixture of hesitation and something deeper, something like a door, that had stayed closed for too long. Lucas swallowed, his thumb brushing across the surface once more, and then he looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes for the first time, really seeing him, not as a stranger in a store, not as a man short a few dollars, but as something else entirely, something that carried weight and history, and his voice came out quieter than he expected, almost disbelieving. "Where did you get this?" But even as he asked, a part of him already knew that the answer was not going to be simple, because some things do not return by accident, and some moments are not interruptions. They are beginnings waiting for the right hands to recognize them. Daniel did not answer right away, his eyes lingering on the object in Lucas's hand as if the past had suddenly been placed back in front of him without warning. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone who had spent years avoiding that exact moment. "I did not get it. It was given to me," he said quietly, the words almost lost beneath the low hum of the store. And Lucas felt something tighten in his chest because the tone was familiar, not the words themselves, but the way they were carried, steady on the surface but fragile underneath. Rex shifted again, sitting down beside Daniel now, his presence calm, grounding, as if he had completed one part of his task and was waiting for the rest to unfold, his gaze moving between the two men with quiet awareness. Lucas looked back down at the badge, turning it slightly so the light caught the engraved symbol more clearly, and the memory came sharper this time. Not a full picture yet, but fragments aligning, a cold night, the smell of dust and metal, a voice telling him to stay still, to breathe, and then hands pulling him towards safety when everything else had felt uncertain. And he inhaled slowly, steadying himself as he looked up again, studying Daniel's face with a new kind of focus. "Someone gave this to you?" Lucas repeated, softer now, and Daniel nodded once, his shoulders easing just slightly, as if the truth, even in small pieces, was lighter than silence. "A long time ago," he added, his gaze drifting past Lucas for a moment, not to the store, but somewhere further, somewhere only he could see, and for a second the room seemed to shift again, the fluorescent lights no longer harsh but distant, the sounds of movement blending into a quiet background that allowed something deeper to surface. The cashier did not interrupt. The other customers remained still, drawn into a moment they did not fully understand but could feel, and Lucas realized then that this was not about the money anymore, not about the bread sitting on the counter waiting to be paid for. It was about something that had been set in motion long before any of them walked into this place. "Do you remember who?" Lucas asked carefully, his voice carrying a respect that had not been there before, and Daniel hesitated, his hand resting lightly on Rex's head now, fingers brushing through the thick fur as if grounding himself in the present. "No," he said after a pause, the words simple but heavy, not clearly, just pieces, and he gave a small, almost apologetic smile that did not quite reach his eyes. It was a long time ago. Things were different then, and Lucas nodded, because he understood that more than most, understood how time could blur the edges of memory until only fragments remained, fragments that only made sense when they found the right place to fit. Rex let out a slow breath, his ears relaxing slightly, and Lucas glanced at him, a faint realization forming that this moment had not been random, that somehow the dog had recognized something neither man had fully seen yet. And as Lucas looked back at Daniel, really looked this time, past the worn coat and the tired posture, he felt the last piece of that memory begin to surface, not as an image, but as a feeling, a recognition that settled deep and steady. And he spoke again, quieter than before. "I think I know," the words barely above a whisper, but enough to shift the air between them, enough to suggest that whatever had been lost in time was about to find its way back. And Daniel's expression changed, just slightly, a flicker of something uncertain but hopeful, as if for the first time in a long while. The past was no longer something to avoid, but something waiting to be understood. Lucas did not move right away, his hand still holding the badge, as if letting go too soon might break whatever fragile connection had just formed. And for a moment, he simply studied Daniel. In silence, not the surface details, but the quiet weight behind his eyes, the kind that came from years of carrying things no one else could see. And then he exhaled slowly, as if releasing a memory that had finally found its place. "It was winter," he said, his voice steady but distant, like he was speaking from somewhere far beyond the walls of the store. "Cold enough that the air felt sharp every time you breathed." And Daniel's fingers stilled against Rex's fur, his gaze sharpening just slightly as something deep inside him began to stir. Lucas lowered his eyes briefly to the badge, turning it once more between his fingers. "I was pinned down," he continued, not with urgency, but with quiet clarity, choosing each word carefully as if rebuilding something piece by piece. "Not hurt, just stuck, disoriented, and everything around me felt like it was closing in." And though he did not describe it in detail, the feeling was there, present in the space between his words. And Daniel's expression shifted again, his brow tightening just slightly as if trying to reach for something just out of grasp. Rex leaned closer to him, pressing his weight gently against Daniel's leg, a steady presence, grounding, and Lucas noticed the way the dog responded not to sound, but to something deeper, something unspoken. And then someone showed up, Lucas said, lifting his gaze again, his eyes locking onto Daniel's. "Did not say much, just told me to stay calm, to breathe, to trust him." And there was a faint change in his voice then, something softer, something that carried more than memory. "He pulled me out when I could not move myself." And the words settled into the air, quiet but heavy, and Daniel's hand slowly slipped from Rex's head, his fingers curling slightly as if they remembered something his mind had not fully caught up to yet. The store remained still, the outside world fading into something distant and irrelevant as the moment deepened. And Lucas took a small step closer, not imposing but drawn in. Before he left, he pressed something into my hand. He continued, lifting the badge just slightly, said I might not remember his face, but I should remember that I was not alone. And Daniel inhaled sharply, not loud, but enough to break the stillness inside him, his eyes narrowing just slightly as if a door had cracked open somewhere deep within his memory. Rex's ears lifted again, his tail giving one slow, certain movement, and Lucas felt it then, the quiet certainty settling into place, the kind that did not need confirmation. "I never saw him again," Lucas said, his voice dropping lower, steadier now. "But I never forgot that moment." And he paused just long enough for the weight of those words to land, before speaking again, softer, almost like a realization spoken aloud. "Until now." And Daniel's gaze locked onto the badge, then back to Lucas, something shifting behind his eyes, not fully recognition yet, but close enough to feel like standing at the edge of a memory that had waited years to be seen again. And in that silence, something passed between them, not spoken, Not explained, but understood in a way that only time and distance could shape, while Rex remained exactly where he was, calm, steady, as if he had known all along that this was not just a meeting, but a return. Daniel's lips parted slightly, but no words came out, only a slow breath that seemed to carry years within it. And he lowered his gaze for a moment, as if searching through something far deeper than memory, something that did not come back all at once, but in fragments, in feelings, in the quiet echo of a moment that had once mattered more than anything. His fingers trembled just slightly as he reached out, not to take the badge, but to touch its edge where Lucas held it, and the contact was light, almost hesitant, like confirming something he was not yet ready to fully believe. And when he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before, stripped of the guarded tone it once carried. "I remember the cold," he said slowly, each word deliberate. "Not the place, not the faces, just the cold, and someone telling me it would be all right." And his brow tightened, as if the effort of holding onto that memory required more strength than he expected. Rex shifted closer again, pressing gently against Daniel's side, his steady presence grounding him. In the present, while something long buried began to rise, and Lucas watched carefully, not interrupting, understanding now that this was not a story being told. It was a memory finding its way back. "You were not supposed to be there," Daniel continued after a moment, his eyes still fixed on the badge. "None of us were. Things changed too fast." And though he did not explain further, there was a weight in his words that filled the silence with meaning. And Lucas felt it, not as a detail, but as truth, the kind that did not need to be fully spoken to be understood. The store remained quiet, the cashier standing still behind the counter, her earlier impatience gone, replaced by something closer to respect, while a man near the door removed his cap without realizing it. As if the moment itself had asked him to, Lucas nodded slowly, his grip on the badge loosening just slightly as he held it out, offering it back, not as an object, but as something that belonged where it had always been, meant to stay. And Daniel accepted it this time, his fingers closing around it with a steadiness that had not been there before, and for a brief second his eyes closed, not in sadness, but in recognition, as if the missing piece had finally found its place. Rex let out a quiet breath, his body relaxing completely now, his task fulfilled, and Lucas felt something shift inside him as well, something lighter, something settled, like a question he had carried for years had finally been answered, without him even knowing he had been asking it. "You saved me," Lucas said quietly, not as a question, but as a simple truth, and Daniel looked up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time, and though there was still uncertainty there was also something else, something warmer, something that had been absent before. "We saved each other," Daniel replied, his voice steadier now, grounded in a reality that had just returned to him, and Lucas gave a small nod, understanding that some debts were never meant to be repaid in the way people expected, because they were not debts at all, but connections, moments that carried forward long after they had passed. The bread still sat on the counter, untouched, the number on the register unchanged, but none of it felt important anymore, not when something far greater had just unfolded in a quiet corner of an ordinary morning. And as Lucas reached into his wallet once more, this time without hesitation, it was not out of obligation, but something deeper, something that felt less like giving and more like honoring what had always been there, waiting to be remembered. Lucas placed the few bills on the counter, more than enough to cover the bread, but he did not step back right away, his hand resting there for a moment, as if grounding himself in something that had just shifted inside him. And the cashier, who had watched everything unfold without a word, slowly nodded and completed the transaction with a quiet respect that needed no explanation, the register finally clearing its small, insignificant number as the tension dissolved into something softer, something almost sacred. Daniel held the badge in his palm, turning it slightly, feeling its weight as if it had changed, or perhaps as if he had, and for the first time since he had walked into the store, his shoulders were no longer hunched, no longer carrying that invisible burden that had followed him for so long, and Rex noticed, his tail moving once, slow and certain, His posture relaxed in a way that spoke of completion rather than curiosity. Lucas picked up the bag of bread and gently handed it to Daniel, not as charity, not as a favor, but as something returned, something that had already been earned long before this moment. And Daniel accepted it with both hands, his grip steady now, his eyes meeting Lucas's with a quiet clarity that had not been there before. Around them, the store began to breathe again, the subtle sounds returning, a cart rolling somewhere in the distance, a door opening with a soft chime. But none of it broke the stillness that remained between the two. Men, a stillness filled with understanding rather than absence. "I never knew your name," Lucas said after a moment, his voice calm, almost reflective, and Daniel gave a faint smile, the kind that carried both humility and something deeper, something restored. "Daniel," he said, simply, and Lucas nodded, repeating it quietly, as if committing it to memory in a way he had not been able to years ago. Daniel. And for a brief second, that name seemed to anchor the entire moment into something real, something that would not fade again. Rex stepped forward then, gently nudging Daniel's hand that held the badge, his eyes lifting to meet his, and Daniel let out a soft breath, almost a quiet laugh. The sound unfamiliar but genuine, his fingers brushing against the dog's head. In a gesture that felt natural, as if some connection had already been there waiting to be acknowledged. Lucas watched it all with a sense of quiet gratitude, not just for the reunion, but for the way it had happened, unplanned, unscripted, guided by something beyond intention, and he reached down to rest his hand briefly on Rex's back, a silent acknowledgement of the role the dog had played, not just as a companion, but as something more, something that could see what people often missed. Daniel adjusted the bag in his hand, the simple weight of it now carrying more meaning than it ever should have. And as he turned toward the door, he paused, looking back once more, not out of hesitation, but out of recognition. "Thank you," he said, the words directed at Lucas, but carrying something broader, something that included the moment, the memory, and the quiet way it had all come back together. Lucas nodded, his expression steady, understanding that some moments did not need more than that. And as the door opened and the cool air slipped inside, Daniel stepped out into the light, no longer just a man who had been short a few dollars, but someone who had been found again in a way that mattered far more. While Rex remained still for a second longer, watching him go, his ears relaxed, his presence calm, as if he knew that what had needed to happen had already been set in motion, and somewhere in that quiet, unspoken space, it felt as though the world had corrected. Something small, something almost invisible, but deeply important all the same. The door closed behind Daniel with a soft chime that lingered longer than it should have, the cool air outside wrapping around him as he stepped onto the sidewalk. And for a moment he did not move, standing there with the bag of bread in one hand and the badge still resting in the other, his fingers tracing its worn edges again, as if confirming it was real, as if confirming that something inside him had truly shifted. The street stretched out in quiet lines, cars passing at a distance, the sky pale with a thin layer of winter light, and yet everything felt different, not brighter, not louder, just steadier, like the ground beneath his feet had finally stopped drifting. Inside the store, Lucas remained near the counter, his eyes still on the door long after Daniel had stepped through it, his posture relaxed now, but his mind far from still, replaying the moment in a way that did not feel like memory, but like understanding, something that had taken years to arrive and had chosen an ordinary morning to do so. Rex sat beside him, calm and composed, his tail resting lightly against the floor, his gaze soft but attentive. And when Lucas finally looked down at him, there was a quiet acknowledgement there, something unspoken but clear. "You knew," Lucas murmured, his voice low, and Rex blinked slowly, as if the answer had never been in question. Outside, Daniel took a slow breath, the kind that filled more than just his lungs, and he began to walk, not hurried, not uncertain, just forward, each step carrying a quiet intention that had not been there before. And as he moved, the sounds of the street seemed to fall into rhythm with him. The distant hum of traffic, the soft crunch beneath his boots, the faint rustle of wind against his coat, all of it grounding him in a present that felt more real than it had in years. He paused at the corner, glancing down at the badge once more. And this time, instead of confusion or distance, there was a faint clarity in his expression, a recognition not of every detail, but of the meaning behind it, the reminder that even in the moments he had forgotten, he had not been lost, not entirely. Back inside, the store slowly returned to its normal pace, but something lingered in the air, a quiet shift in the way people moved, the way they spoke, as if they had all witnessed. Something they could not fully explain, but would not easily forget, and Lucas stepped away from the counter at last, adjusting his jacket as he moved toward the door, Rex rising smoothly beside him, ready without being told. As they stepped outside, the light met them with a gentle brightness, and Lucas scanned the sidewalk until he found Daniel just ahead, still walking, still holding that same steady pace. And for a moment, Lucas considered calling out, saying something more, adding words to what had already been said, but instead he remained quiet, understanding that some moments did not need to be extended, they needed to be respected. Rex, however, took a single step forward, then stopped, his ears tilting slightly as if catching something on the edge of hearing. And Lucas followed his gaze, noticing the way Daniel slowed just slightly, not stopping but aware, as if he could feel that he was no longer walking entirely alone. And in that quiet space between them, something remained open, not unfinished, but still unfolding, like a story that had found its way back to the surface. Not to end, but to continue in a way neither of them had expected. Daniel slowed just enough for the sound of footsteps behind him to settle into awareness. Not loud, not urgent, but steady, and when he turned slightly, he saw Lucas and Rex approaching at an easy pace, not chasing him down, not interrupting, just closing the quiet distance that had formed between them. And there was something in that approach that felt different, not like a coincidence, but like a continuation of something already set in motion. The morning light had shifted a little, stretching longer shadows across the sidewalk. And as Daniel stopped fully this time, he adjusted the bag in his hand, the simple weight of it grounding him while the badge rested against his palm, warmer now from his touch, as if it had finally found where it belonged. Lucas came to a stop a few feet away, close enough to speak, but not so close that it felt like pressure, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The quiet between them, carrying more meaning than words could easily hold, while Rex stepped forward just slightly, his gaze moving from one man to the other with calm certainty. "There's something else," Lucas said finally, his voice even, but thoughtful, as if he had been turning the idea over in his mind since the moment inside the store, and Daniel's brow lifted just slightly, not in suspicion, but in quiet curiosity, the kind that comes when something already feels familiar before it is explained. Lucas reached into his jacket slowly, careful in the movement, and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, worn at the edges in a way that suggested it had been carried for a long time, and he held it there for a moment before offering it forward, not insisting, just presenting it as something that belonged in this moment as much as the badge did. Daniel hesitated, then reached out, his fingers brushing the paper before taking it fully, and when he unfolded it, the creases opened with a soft, almost fragile sound, revealing a short line written in careful, steady handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still clear enough to read, and his eyes moved across the words slowly, as if each one carried more weight than it should have. "If you ever find your way back, follow the place where the light stays on," Daniel read quietly, his voice barely above the breeze that passed between them. And something shifted again, deeper this time, not just recognition, but direction, like a path that had been hidden was suddenly visible. Lucas watched him closely, not interrupting, understanding that this was not about explanation. It was about realization, and after a moment, Daniel looked up, meeting his eyes with something steadier now, something that held both question and understanding at once. "You kept this," Daniel said, not as an accusation, but as a quiet acknowledgement, and Lucas nodded once, his expression calm. "I did not know why, not until now," he replied, and Rex let out a slow breath. His posture relaxed but attentive, as if confirming that this, too, was part of what needed to be revealed. The street moved around them, people passing in the distance, unaware of the quiet turning point unfolding in the space between three figures standing beneath the soft morning light. And Daniel folded the paper carefully, holding it alongside the badge, the two objects now connected in a way that felt inevitable rather than coincidental. And as he looked down the road ahead, his gaze lingered just a second longer than before, as if he could already see something waiting for him there, something tied to that simple line about a place where the light never went out. And in that moment, the past no longer felt like something behind him, but something guiding him forward, one quiet step at a time. Daniel stood there a moment longer, the folded paper resting against the worn badge in his hand, both of them carrying a quiet weight that no longer felt heavy, but guiding. And when he finally looked up again, there was a calmness in his eyes that had not been there before, not because everything was suddenly clear, but because something inside him had settled, like a compass that had finally found its direction. The street stretched ahead in soft morning light, the kind that did not demand attention but revealed things slowly, gently, and Daniel took a step forward, then another, not looking back this time, because for the first time in a long while he was not walking away from something, he was walking toward it. Lucas remained where he was, watching quietly, his hands resting at his sides, his posture steady, and though he did not follow, there was no distance in the way he looked at Daniel. Only a quiet understanding that whatever came next was something Daniel had to reach on his own, and Rex sat beside him, calm and still, his gaze fixed on a man moving further down the sidewalk, his ears relaxed, his presence no longer alert, but complete. A soft breeze moved through the street, carrying the faint scent of bread from the bag Daniel held, warm against the cool air, and he glanced down at it briefly, a small, almost unnoticeable smile touching the corner of his mouth. Because it was never just about the bread, it never had been. It was about the moment, the connection, the return of something he did not know he had lost. The words on the paper echoed quietly in his mind, not as instructions, but as an invitation, the place where the light stays on. And though he did not yet know exactly where that place was, he felt something steady pulling him forward. Not urgency, not pressure, just a quiet certainty that he would recognize it when he saw it. Behind him, the door to the store opened and closed again, life continuing as it always did. But for Lucas, nothing felt quite the same, and he let out a slow breath, glancing down at Rex. "You brought him back," he said softly, and Rex blinked once, his tail moving just slightly against the ground, as if acknowledging something that did not need to be explained. Lucas lifted his gaze again, watching until Daniel became just another figure in the distance, blending into the quiet rhythm of the street. But even then, something remained, not visible, not tangible, but present, like a thread that had been tied between past and present, between two lives that had crossed once before and somehow found each other again. Daniel reached the corner and paused briefly, his hand tightening slightly around the badge and the paper, and for a second he looked up at the sky, pale and open above him, and then he turned, choosing a direction without hesitation, his steps steady, his path his own. And in that quiet moment, it felt as though something unseen had shifted into place, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of stillness that only comes when something is exactly where it is meant to be, and somewhere ahead. Beyond the streets and the passing hours, a light was, waiting, not to be found by chance, but by someone who had finally remembered how to follow it.